Hello everybody, my name is John Mark Johnson Jr. and I'm the host of Reformed GGA, and today I'm going to be talking about some sighting systems that I've used over the years. This is just my personal experience with sights and sighting systems. It is certainly not exhaustive. There are lots of different sighting systems out there, the vast majority of which I have never messed with. But for people who are new to shooting and new to using optics on their guns, you'll probably find some information here that will be useful, or at least hopefully you'll be able to learn from some of my mistakes. Now, like most of you out there, I started with open sights because open sights are typically what the gun comes with, and they work, and so for the longest time that's what I use, because it comes with the gun, it's no extra expense, suitably functional. Okay, that's great. As time went on, though, I started noticing that I have certain limitations, especially vision problems, as denoted by the glasses, that really kept me from using open sights as well as I could. I still practice with open sights from time to time because it's a good skill to have, but for someone with the kinds of vision problems that I do, open sights definitely have their point at which they just become frustrating. And there are certain applications, especially if you're someone like me who has vision problems, where open sights don't do particularly well. One of the first things that I noticed was that when it came to using my guns as a bedside gun. Originally, when I first started getting into guns as an adult, I got into it mostly just for plinking purposes. You know, I wanted to make a statement that I'm pro-gun, and I wanted to go out and have some fun shooting with friends. You know, friends and family go shooting. It's not nice to be a bum and, you know, use their guns and ammo all the time. It's nice if you bring your own stuff and that kind of thing. And so that's kind of why I started getting into it. I got myself a .22 rifle. Still have it, by the way. Good little shooter, fun gun, and that's kind of what I started out with, and of course it had open sights, and it was perfectly functional. But as time went on, and the world got crazier, and 2020 has definitely gotten crazy, but this was even before that. World's getting crazier, things just seem like they're getting worse and worse, and so I decided that, you know, maybe I should start using guns as something to actually defend myself with, and I went out and got myself a little bit bigger caliber 9mm. At the time, 9mm was rather inexpensive. Nowadays that is not the case at all. 2020 has killed ammo prices across the board. 9mm is no longer a cheap round. It used to be pretty cheap. It used to be about 20 cents a round or so for the plinking stuff. Of course, defensive rounds are going to cost more, but you usually don't go through a ton of defensive rounds. You go through enough to test the gun, make sure it's reliable, and then from there it's just cycling enough ammunition through to make sure that it, you know, doesn't really go bad or get too dinged up by being used in the gun temporarily, things like that. So you don't usually go through that much of it, but switched over to 9mm because it packs a little bit more of a punch, and it was still fairly cheap, so I could still go out and plink with it if I wanted to. But it was a little bit more powerful, and I said, okay, if I have to defend myself, you know, 9mm is going to be better than that, at least better than the .22 I had at the time. And as I started using it as my bedside gun, the one thing that really got to me real quick is that, well, when I go to bed, I don't have my glasses on, of course. And so if I get up and I point the gun at something, I actually can't see the front sight. That's a little bit of a problem. The front sight is blurry. With my vision being what it is, I can usually make out general shapes just fine without my glasses on, and I can usually tell enough details to at least pick out, you know, friend or foe, those kinds of things. But a fine detail like a front post, it's blurry. I can't make it out well enough to actually use it. And so I needed a sighting system that could be used even with my vision being what it is without my glasses on. I needed something that I could use without my glasses. And that is when I got my first red dot sight. And the first red dot sight that I got myself was one of the ones that's on this gun here. Now this gun was not my first 9mm, although this one is a 9mm. I frequently use it as a traveling bedside gun in those places where I'm legally allowed to have it. As things go on, who knows what all is going to happen with that, but for right now, there are many places where I'm legally allowed to have it, and so I do have it in those places. But my other 9mm gun was X95-4 9mm, which is, in retrospect, a little overdone, but yeah, it was that was like a tax return gift to myself or something like that. So yeah, overdone, but you know, I could afford it, so it was okay. But this one is a good enough example of it. I got a red dot sight, and this particular one, we'll see if I can get it on camera here and hold it still enough for you guys to see. It is the Holosun 403C red dot sight, and this was a huge improvement over the open sights, primarily because it projects a red dot that I could pick up even without my glasses on. So regardless of whether or not I could make out something like the front post or not, I could always make out that red dot, glasses or no glasses, and that means I could use it as a bedside gun without worrying about whether or not I'm going to have enough time to get my glasses on. All I need to do is grab the gun and go. That was a wonderful thing. But I did wind up learning some things about red dot sights kind of the hard way, and especially about these Holosuns. Holosuns are relatively inexpensive, which is one of the things that drove me to them as well. That is, it works without my glasses on, because it's a red dot sight that I can pick up basically no matter what. And what really appealed to me at the time is that they're relatively inexpensive. The Holosun 403Cs usually cost 200-ish bucks. Sometimes 250, sometimes on sale you can get them for 150 if you find them on a really good sale. Maybe you have a friend who has a used one or something like that that's still in good working order. Sometimes you can get them considerably less, but usually 200-ish bucks. And so it wasn't something that was going to break the bank. The guns that I was putting them on were usually, you know, $1,000 to $1,500 guns. A red dot sight that only costs $200 relative to that kind of cost isn't really that much. And especially when you consider that it actually allows you to use it without glasses on, for me, was a really big deal. But like I said, I learned some things kind of the hard way, and I'll start with very simple and obvious things. And remember, this is when I was relatively new to the gun scene, didn't know a whole lot of stuff, wound up making some very simple mistakes. One mistake that is not really so much a mistake, but kind of a common sense thing, and it's amazing when you're new to things how little common sense you have. But the lens cap, I discovered, is something that you should not put in your pocket. These lens caps that the Holosuns are shipped with tend to attract lint really, really, really well, and so if you put them in your pocket, which is basically full of lint, they will get covered in lint, and it's not so good, so don't do that. Also, one of the things that is kind of annoying about these lens caps is you can actually put them on backwards, which is what I'm doing right here, and if you're not looking and thinking about it, it technically fits. But the problem is that if you put this in the case and then the case gets jostled around in transit or something like that, when it's on backwards like this, it can actually get knocked loose and then your lenses aren't covered anymore. It seems fairly obvious, but if you're not paying attention, you do stupid things. The way that it's supposed to work is the thick lens cover goes on the protrusion in the front that is actually thicker, and then the small lens cover, the thin one, goes on the protrusion in the back that is thinner. And that keeps it nice and secure, and if it gets jostled around in transit, it doesn't come loose. I know, stupid, obvious, but, you know, when you're not thinking, and given that the two lenses on these things are the exact same size, you know, you make stupid mistakes. So that is something that I learned the hard way. Something else that I learned about these things is that the screw that is used to tighten them is really easy to over tighten. And in fact, it was either the first or the second one that I got. I can't remember which one. It might have been the second one. Maybe it was the first. I don't know. But on one of them, I actually broke that screw through over tightening it. At the time, all that I was relying to keep the optic on the gun was just a whole lot of tension on the screw. And then, after that, I discovered the wonderful thing called Loctite thread locker. This stuff is wonderful for putting on optics, and especially red dots. I didn't know this at the time because, you know, new to everything and you don't know what to do, and it says it comes with the screw and you tighten down the screw. Yeah, you're supposed to use thread locker, it turns out. And when I first started using thread locker, because everybody recommended that I do that, I put it like on everything and turned the whole base of the optic white with all this extra Loctite that was all over everything. It looked absolutely horrible, but it stayed on the gun, so that was great. And I wasn't concerned with over tightening the screws anymore, because I know the Loctite would hold everything together for me, so I kept the screws in place and didn't break them, so that part was good. But as time went on, I eventually got to mounting them fairly well, where you don't have a bunch of, you know, Loctite all over the gun, and figured out that thread locker goes on threads. That is a very important rule, kids, just saying. So on the screw that goes through the base, you put some of the Loctite, some of the thread locker on the actual threads of the screw, and when you screw it through, a little bit of it will come through and protrude on the other side. That's the discoloration that you see there, but that's basically the only place that you really need it for mounting. And I got in the habit of putting a little bit of the thread locker on the outside of the screw as that you put on the head of the screw as well. And what that does is, well, the thread locker that you actually put on the threads is what actually holds it together. The thread locker that you put on the head of the screw keeps that head of the screw from wobbling, because of course the hole that the screw goes into is just a little bit bigger than the head of the screw is. And under recoil, that head of the screw will start wobbling in there, and if it wobbles on this side, that wobble is going to transfer over to the side with the threads, and eventually it's going to break the thread locker seal on the threads, and you don't want that. So you put a little bit of thread locker on the actual threads, and when you screw it in, a little bit is going to push through, but that's okay. And you also put a little bit of thread locker on the head of the screw, basically to fill in the gaps of the hole to keep it from wobbling around in there, and that way you don't have to apply very much torque. You want to make it good and snug, but you don't really need to overdo it, because I found out that breaks it. At the time, I didn't know any better. Now I know it doesn't take a hole. First, use thread locker. It's a lot better than over tightening the screw and winding up breaking it. And you don't need a ton. You need to have some on the actual threads, and then you need to have some on the head of the screw. And as long as you have it in those two places, you're good to go. Some people would even say that the thread locker on the head of the screw is not technically necessary, and they're probably right, but making sure that you fill in that hole and keeping it from wobbling is important to me. Once it's there, I want it to stay there. So that's the way I do that. But aside from those little adventures and misapplying it and putting it on incorrectly, I really liked these optics, and of course I still use them. This is a gun that I have in active rotation. Like I said, it's my traveling bedside gun. I still use the 403 red dot sight. It has pretty good battery life. The battery life on a medium setting, I think it's like setting 5 or setting 7. Lots of these sights that I'm going to tell you guys about that have an electronic component to them will usually have 10 to 12 settings, and most of them are made so that they have a pretty long battery life at, say, somewhere between setting 5 and setting 7. I don't consider those settings to be overly practical, but that's usually the advertised battery life setting, is somewhere between 5 and 7. And within that range, this is advertised to have a battery life of about 30,000 hours. To put that in context, 1 year has less than 8,800 hours in it. So if this is 30,000 hours, that's a maximum lifespan of well over 3 years, about 3.5 years. Now, like I said, I don't usually keep this thing on that low of a setting, and so it's going to tend to burn out faster than that. With most of my optics that have some kind of electronic component to them, I usually just change out the batteries once a year, basically when you do it with the smoke detectors, and that keeps everything running nice and good, and you don't have to worry about anything. Most of them have very long battery lives anyways, and so if you just change it yearly, you're usually pretty good. This one also has a solar augment on it, and it has basically 2 modes that it's in. Its default mode will actually use this solar panel as a sensor, and it will adjust the brightness based on what the ambient light is. So if the ambient light is low, the red dot will be at a lower setting. If the ambient light is high, it will actually take the solar energy through the solar pack, give it a little bit of a boost and give you a little bit brighter dot. And so that is cool. The nice thing about this one in that default mode is that it's always on. The thing never turns off. It's always on. It's always rated to go at least to some minimum degree. Now, when I actively use the gun, I usually don't leave it in that default mode because the default setting is usually kind of on the low side, and I don't like that. Like I said, I have vision problems, and even with my glasses on, I usually can't pick out stuff all that well, and so I usually need a little bit brighter setting. And so I'm usually, sitting around level somewhere between level 8 and level 10 most of the time. So usually a little bit higher than whatever the default setting is. And for that, you need to go out of the default mode and you need to go over into the manual mode. And the way that you do that is these two adjustment buttons on the side. One's plus, one's minus, brighter and lesser. And what you do is you just press and hold both of those. Actually, I'm sorry. You just press and hold the front one for 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3, and it will kick it into manual mode, and then you can use the buttons to adjust up and down, and that's about where I like it, about 2 steps off of the maximum brightness, and that's pretty good. Also, these ones are such that you can adjust them low enough that you can work them with what's it called? With night vision. With some kind of night vision system. A lot of times illuminated reticles are too bright for night vision setups, but the Holosuns and a lot of the companies are actually starting to do it now, so I can't say a lot of them aren't. But the daytime settings and even a lot of the nighttime settings are usually way too bright for night vision. And so on the bottom end of the scale, there's a couple of settings that this has that are extremely, extremely, extremely dim, but with a night vision setup on, you'll be able to pick it up just fine. Okay. And so that's how you get it into manual mode, is you press and hold the plus for 3 seconds, then you can adjust it up and down. And to put it back into the default mode that'll rely on the solar input, you just press both of them together and it goes into default mode. It still never turns off though. There's always going to be a red dot in there. It's just a question of how bright it is. If it's in its default mode, the brightness will depend on the ambient light. If there's a lot of ambient light, the solar panel will use that extra ambient light and the energy from that to provide a little bit of a boost, and you'll get a little bit brighter dot. If you don't have much ambient light, then the dot that's coming out of there will be relatively low power. So that is what it is. When I use it actively, I usually prefer to put it into manual mode and basically take it all the way up and then back off a couple of steps, and that's usually bright enough for just about anything that could happen. So I've really come to like these, and I really like this for my traveling gun just because it tends to travel pretty well. And by the way, if you put it into manual mode and you forget to take it out of manual mode, because like I said, when I put it in manual mode, I usually bump it up pretty high. And over the long term, that could be a bit of a problem because, like I said, it's like level 9 or level 10. And that eats up a lot of battery. But fortunately, what this thing will do is after 12 hours, it'll kick out of manual mode and go back into the default mode, which is much lower and preserves your battery life. So what I do is I put it into manual mode basically before bed. And of course, my sleep cycle is not 12 hours. Sometimes I wish it was. But on a typical work day and whatnot, that just doesn't work. So 12 hours is more than enough time for it to be at the brightness that I want it to be left at, so that if something happens at night and don't have my glasses on, I can still use the sight and do whatever I need to do. And then either in the morning I can physically put it back into default mode, or even if I forget to put it into default mode and pack it up and get going with it, it'll automatically kick out of that and at the end of whatever the 12-hour limit is, and save my battery from dying on the spot on me. And that's one of the things that I like about this sight. Doesn't have the longest battery life out there, but I can put it in manual mode for a good long time. Like I said, up to 12 hours. And if I forget to take it out of manual mode after that 12 hours, it'll take care of itself, put it back to a fairly low setting, and It's always ready to go. The red dot on this one is always on. I'll always have at least a red dot. It might be at a low level if it's in default mode, but I'll always have it. Alright, and then after getting into red dots and the solar augmented ones, then I wound up getting myself a proper rifle. Not just a 9mm gun, but a proper rifle that was chambered in 5.56. That particular rifle was the Kel-Tec RDB, and it did not work out so well for me. I never got that thing to really run right. But I did wind up with an optic from that, and that is this one right here. This is the high power variable optic. How high power it is a little debatable, but it's a high power variable optic in the sense that it doesn't have a one level of magnification. It doesn't go all the way to the bottom. This is the Crossfire 2 from Vortex, and its magnification range is 4 to 12, so 4x up to 12x, 4 times larger up to 12 times larger, and the lens size is 40 millimeters, so it's a 4 to 12 by 40. And when I first got this thing, it had all kinds of dials and gizmos and gadgets on it. Oh, before I go away from the 403C Holosun, one thing that I did want to explain, because sometimes people miss it, I found that with these things, if you actually take the time to read the instruction manual, there's amazing things that you'll find in there that are really useful, but a lot of people don't do that. And one of the things is the turrets for adjusting the sight. There are some people that think that these little things on the top and on the side are the way that you adjust where it's zeroed, and that is not true, or at least not completely true. What these are actually turret covers, and so if you screw these off, I have them on there pretty tight just because I don't like them flying off, but if you unscrew them, the actual turret is underneath, and you'll notice that has a slot in it, and the top of the cover has a little slot, and those actually match up. And then inside you'll see some lettering, and you'll also see a little arrow in there, and that lettering in the arrow tells you basically what direction to turn for moving your point of impact in a given direction. So this particular one says to move the top turret up, you want to move the turret counterclockwise. And then the other turret on the side has the same thing, and of course it's the one that's left to right, and so you would do counterclockwise to move your points of impact to the right. And you'll find this with a lot of the optics. A lot of the optics will have turret covers on them, and turning the turret cover doesn't do anything for where your point of impact is. You have to actually take off the turret cover, and then you can get to the turret. There are some sites out there that basically have exposed turrets. Those ones are usually fairly expensive sites though. Alright, getting back to the kind of sort of high power variable optic, and I call it high power just because it doesn't go all the way down to 1 power like a true low power variable optic is. It's not super high power, it's up to 14 magnification. But yeah, this thing had lots of gizmos and gadgets on it, and really wasn't sure exactly what everything was to begin with, so I'll let you guys know so that you don't make the mistakes that I did. In addition to the turrets, well, these are turret covers. Just like on the little red dot, you have to unscrew the turret cover to actually get to the actual turret. And again, they have directions on them for which direction you turn to move your point of impact in a given direction. A lot of them are like that. They'll tell you which way to go. And these ones are nice because you don't need a special tool to move them. You can just hand move them. And so for long range shooting and being able to adjust for different sizes and windage and whatnot, that's a lot handier. But the other thing that I didn't know at the time and eventually wound up learning was what to do with all these little dials. You can see where there's actually some grooves in 3 different places along the thing, and that really confused me because, okay, And I didn't know what the 4 to 12 by 40 meant and all those kinds of things. I didn't know that the 4 to 12 was the magnification range and the 40 was the size of the lens. Had no idea about that, so it was kind of trial and error learning about all that stuff. Eventually, what I wound up finding out is that this dial right back here that has the numbers that go from 4 all the way up to the 12, that determines the level of magnification. I was new to sights, didn't know, and again, like a lot of people, I didn't pay enough attention to directions. Go figure. So that determines the level of magnification for me when I had the gun on my the optic on my 5.56 gun. I typically liked magnification level 6 the most. For me, that seemed to work pretty well. But for different people, depending on what distance you're shooting at, that's going to change, but that's what I liked. And then the other two things that you can twist have a little bit different effect. The one up here, I found out was basically a parallax compensator. And parallax is something that happens because of basically misalignment between your head and the optic. So you can kind of imagine what's going on by taking two fingers and imagining that the far one is your target and the one that's closer to you is your optic. Now you can arrange them so that the two look like they're right on top of each other, but if you move your head from one side to the other, they're not going to appear like they're on top of each other anymore. That's basically what parallax is. The gun can be pointed right at the target, but if your head is in the wrong spot, that optic isn't going to look like it's aligned even if it is. And so if it doesn't look like it's aligned properly because your head is off to one side, people will often move the gun so that it looks like it's on, but because their head wasn't in the right position, they'll actually be off the target a little bit, or at least off the center point that they wanted to hit. What this does is it actually basically, through the use of a special lens, moves the focal plane of your optic to the target so that the two always look like they're right on top of each other and you get accurate shots. What I thought originally, because I was stupid and I didn't know anything, what I originally thought was that it was basically just kind of fine-tuning on the scope. You know, this one kind of determines how big it is, and then this one kind of tinkers it down a little bit and makes it crisper and clearer, which to a certain extent is true, but that's not the point. The point is to get the focal plane of your optic and the focal plane of the target to be lined up properly for them to mesh. And that's why this one has markings on it that go from 10 yards all the way up to 200 and even infinity. And so what that is doing is that it is making those two focal planes line up at those distances. Now, if you get used to what it looks like properly in the scope and figure out what the reticle looks like when it's actually properly placed over the target, you can actually use this as an impromptu ranging device, at least out to 200 yards. But beyond that, there's very little parallax problems, and that's the issue with parallax. Parallax tends to take care of itself the further out you go. So if you're shooting at 300 yards or 400 yards or 500 yards, there's usually not much parallax to have to worry about anyways. Parallax is usually more of a problem close in than it is further away. And that's why it has the infinity setting, saying, okay, we're sufficiently past 200 yards. It's just parallax isn't really going to be much of an issue. This is going to be a good enough adjustment that'll take care of any parallax you have out beyond this point. So that's why that is. But if you're using it something that's significantly less, you know, basically 200 and under, and you know what the reticle is supposed to look like, you can actually use it as an impromptu ranging device. Okay, so I twist this thing enough to make sure that the two line up properly. That's about how far away the target is. And if you're dealing with a projectile that, say, is a fairly slow-moving projectile or has a particularly poor ballistic coefficient, sometimes you'll get a bit of shift in 200 yards. With a lot of the faster moving projectiles like 5.56, that's not really a big deal. But with some of the slower projectiles, like say 7.62 by 39, or if you're using a pistol caliber, like 9mm or something like that, that moves considerably slower, then yeah, being able to compensate for those distances is a little bit of an issue. And this one kind of gives you an idea of how to range, and will allow you to range your target without using a rangefinder or a BDC or something like that. So that was kind of cool. And then the rear little twisty turny knob I found is the diopter, and what it does is it takes everything else that's going on and it adjusts it for your particular eye. And I found that just how I have my glasses situated on my face is enough to change it so that I actually have to change the diopter. But what it does is it takes all that and it focuses it down to you, and accounts for your particular eye. So in theory, somebody could be shooting this at a particular target at a particular range, get the magnification where they want, get the parallax taken care of, and then hand it off to somebody else, hand the gun off to somebody else and have them shoot at that same target in the same range. And theoretically, the only thing that that other person should have to adjust is just the rear diopter. That should be the only thing that they have to mess with, if even that. If their eyes are close enough in vision, or in my case corrected vision, then it won't be much of an issue. But if they have to adjust anything, it should just be the last one, the diopter. Didn't know that at the time, but it turns out it works, and it works pretty good. This is not a very expensive optic. The main optic costs about $200, which I was pretty excited about, until I found out that it doesn't include the mounting material. Red dots, which were my first foray into those kinds of things, they include the mounts most of the time with the red dots. With low power variable optics and high power variable optics, and like I said, technically this one's kind of a high power variable optic because it doesn't go all the way down to 1x. It's at least 4 times magnification on this one. They don't usually include the mounting hardware, so you have to get the little rings separately. And this one has a pretty big objective, and so in order to raise it up enough to get it actually off the gun so it's not touching the gun, you need risers as well, and that gets a little bit expensive. These rings cost about $50, and a pair of risers, depending on which ones you get, especially if you get halfway decent ones, those are going to be at least $50 as well. So when everything's said and done, this optic went from a $200 optic, which I was happy about, to being about a $300 optic, which was not so fun. Yeah, like I said, that particular gun didn't work very well, and I eventually wound up selling it and getting an AR in 5.56, and I put this on that, and it worked fine for that application. But I'm not a huge fan of ARs in the first place, and with ammo prices being what they are in 2020, I decided 5.56 was a little too expensive for my taste, and so I switched over to 7.62 by 39 guns because the ammo's cheaper. And for those kinds of guns, I personally felt that this kind of optic system was simply more complex than I needed, because it has lots of extra weird little twisty-turny bits that I just didn't want to have to mess with. And also, this one doesn't have any illumination in it, so it means that if I wanted to use it as some kind of a bedside gun or something like that, it really wouldn't be very usable. And also, with it being stuck at a fairly high magnification level, at least 4, that's the lowest setting. For self-defense purposes, that's kind of a high magnification level, especially, just going across the room or something like that. So, didn't want to go that way. But in the meantime, before I went over to 7.62 by 39, and while I still had the high power variable optic there, the Vortex Crossfire, Crossfire 2, I discovered the Shake Awake red dots. And these things are awesome. This one is a Holosun 403B GR standing for green. So this is a green dot sight instead of a typical red dot sight. And the nice thing about these Shake Awakes is that, as the name implies, they're off most of the time. You leave them alone, let them set for a while, usually somewhere around 10 minutes. You can actually change how long it is before they go off, but the default setting is about 10 minutes. Leave them alone for about 10 minutes and they'll automatically cut off. Now technically the electronics are still on because they have to be able to sense the time and those kinds of things, But what happens is as soon as you move the gun, and it doesn't take much movement at all, the optic will come back on. At least the reticle will come back on. And these things have a super long battery life by comparison. The 403C that I've been relying on up until that point had an estimated 30,000 hour battery life. That's at a kind of a medium setting. And this one, the 403B at a medium setting, was about a 50,000 hour battery life, which is pretty awesome. So you get better battery life, and that's because it's not on all the time. But as soon as you move the gun, it turns on, so it's basically still on when you need it. I don't like these ones for traveling, because when I travel, it's back in the case shaking all the time, and so it winds up always being on, and that will eat up a lot of battery. Now there is a way to manually turn it off. The only problem is I don't always remember to manually turn them off, and so that's kind of useless for me. But as a shake awake, they work really good for home defense if it's your gun that you actually leave at home. Like I said, it's not so great for traveling because the shake awake will turn it on. You can manually turn it off and then turn back on the shake awake feature, etc., etc. But I usually leave it just in the default shake awake mode. Well, that's actually not the default. Well, yes, it is. Yeah, that's the default shake awake mode on this one. And it's just simpler to have the other one for traveling gun. But this one would be a very close contender. Like I said, it is technically possible to manually turn it off so that it doesn't shake awake while it's in transit. But like I said, I almost always forget to turn my optics off, and so that wouldn't be a good option for me. That would turn a very long lasting battery life into a very short lasting battery life, just because I forget to turn them off. But the nice thing about it is, as long as the place that you leave it is stable and not shifting, it will turn itself off and it's good to go. The problem is just, putting it inside of, a carry case that goes in the back of the car that bounces around. Well, you're technically leaving it alone, but the fact that it's in the back of the car bouncing around means it's going to turn itself on. So they're not good traveling optics that way, but very long battery life, and I personally really like the green dot versions. It's a little easier to pick up, especially in inside conditions. But it works very similar to the other one. It doesn't have the solar panel on top. It said the adjustments for how bright it is or how dark it is are up there. And again, similar things. You press and hold one button for a few seconds, then it'll change the modes on it, and then you can play with it, have the adjustments, all that. And you hit both of them at the same time to kick it out of that mode, kind of thing. So plus for a few seconds, we'll change it into one mode, hit both of them together to get out of that mode. And that's the same for both the 403C and the 403B. It's just what mode it is in. In the 403C, you get a default mode that will always have at least some level of red dot. And this one, when you kick it from one mode to the other, it completely shuts it off. And there's a few people that I found online that thought that their optic had died, when it turns out that they had actually just turned it off. But yeah, so don't do that. Read your instructions. It's a good thing. Okay, and then after, can't actually remember where I got that one in the sequence, but around that same time frame, either a little bit before or a little bit after, then I switched over to the reflex style of red dot sights. This is still technically a red dot sight. It's just been compacted down a little bit. And this one actually combines kind of the two features from the previous red dot sights that I showed you. It has a solar augment, but it's also a shake awake. And there's two ways that you can run it. You can run it as a solar augment with shake awake, or what I do is I just do it as a shake awake. And the reason why I do it as just a shake awake is because I don't like the solar thing, because the solar thing tends to take over and it will decide for me where the brightness level should be. And I and it usually disagree on how bright it should be. I usually want it fairly high. It usually puts it somewhere in the middle, or sometimes fairly low if there's not much ambient light. And I don't like that. I like it to be fairly bright. I want to be always able to pick up the dot no matter what. So I put it in manual mode, where I manually get to determine what brightness it comes onto when it shakes awake. But fantastic. This is the gun I usually carry. This is my common everyday carry gun, and while it's on me, because I'm shaking and I'm moving, the reticle is always good to go. But when I take off the gun at the end of the day and I set it somewhere, then the shake awake after about 10 minutes will turn it off. But again, as soon as I go to put it on the next day, just the simple act of putting it on turns it back on again. The only thing that I would say is bad about this one, now technically if you use the solar augmented one, the solar default where it takes the solar and the shake awake together, that can actually be very long lasting. It can have up to 100,000 hours of battery life. That's really good. The first one that I showed you was only 30,000 hours. The second one I showed you was 50,000 hours. This one, if you put it in its default mode, up to 100,000 hours of battery life, which is pretty stinking awesome. Like I said, I don't do that because I disagree with the default settings as to how bright it should be. But if you're looking for really long battery life, you can get it out of that. The one thing that I would say is a bit of a disadvantage with this one, though, is that handguns don't have the natural resting point, that third point of contact that rifles do or brace pistols do. And because of that, getting used to where the optic lines up can be a little bit difficult. And for me, I've done it enough times that I kind of naturally point out there. You just practice your draw and point, Please make sure that you practice with an unloaded gun or with dummy rounds. Obviously, don't use live ammunition for that. But if you practice it enough times and you do it on a regular basis, like say every morning before you actually load the gun, you do a few reps of drawing your gun and presenting on target, you'll get pretty used to it. But for a lot of people, especially people who don't practice enough, using just the simple dot that this one has, this is the 407, and what is that? It is, yes, the 407C. Let's see if I can get it to... it's not wanting to show up very well. I apologize for that. It's part of the problems with working with incidental kinds of things. But yeah, that's the 407C, and the problem with the 400 series is that it's just a single dot, which for rifles and brace pistols is fine, but because handguns are typically a little harder to naturally point with a dot, I would recommend that you instead get the version that has the circle and the dot. It'll have a big circle and then a little dot in the center. And the nice thing about those is if you come up and you're a little bit off, you can usually at least see part of the circle. A lot of times they'll have like a 65 MOA circle and then the little dot in the middle. And that big old circle, well, if you come up and it's a little awkward or off, you'll usually still be able to see at least part of the circle and reorient from there. That does eat up more battery life, and so instead of changing it out once a year like I do, you might want to change out the battery every 6 months or so. But it is a little bit easier to find the dot. Or, like I said, you can just practice on a daily basis, and after a while you'll get used to presenting and pointing, and it won't be an issue. But again, a lot of people don't practice as often as they do, so having a big circle with the aiming dot in the middle works a little bit better for people, because even if you present a little bit off, you'll still at least get part of that circle in the optic and be able to adjust from there. Now this one is a little bit different, it is worth noting, and that the battery basically sits up on the bottom of the optic, and so to change the battery you actually have to dismount the optic, and so this is one of the few that I haven't put much Loctite on. I put a little bit of Loctite on it, and you can see just a little bit of discoloration on the back side of the screw where some of the Loctite gets pushed through. But I don't use much, and I don't use basically any on the side of the screw head, just because I have to get in there fairly often. Like I said, every year with the single dots. If you use the one with the circle in the single dot, then it's about every 6 months. And you might ask, does that really change the zero? In my experience, it actually doesn't do that. Your experience might be different, and depends on how you have it set up. But you usually don't have to worry about it being horribly off. I always recommend that if you take an optic apart and put it back together, that you always go and re-zero your gun anyways. But in my experience, it hasn't been a real big deal. So there is that. Okay, but this gun usually holds everything pretty nice and tight anyway, so not a big issue. And then the final kind of optic that I have been experimenting with is this kind right here. This is the one that I use on my AK now, on my full-size AK. And that's what this whole bottom rail system is a method to actually mount it to the side of the AK. So it mounts on the side and then it comes up over the top of the receiver. And what I like about these ones is that they are a magnification type optic. This one in particular is a 2x, not very high magnification. They make them in different levels. I've seen 1.5x, I've seen 2x, I've seen 2.75x, I've seen 3x, I've seen 4x, I've seen 5x, 6x. Varying magnification levels, usually a little on the lower side, you know, not like 24x or something like that. Usually on the lower side. But the nice thing about them is that they are fixed magnification. It is what it is. You're not going to mess with it because you can't mess with them. And they're also built like tanks. They're fixed magnification, so there's only one setting. There's no adjusty, twisty, turning knobs for the most part. There's one at the end, the diopter, that helps adjust it for your eye. But that's it as far as the actual variable parts of the optic. There is no magnification. Changeability. There is no parallax changeability. It basically just is what it is. It's a very simple optic to work with. Again, has turret covers like a lot of the lower end optics do, and the back end of that turret cover fits into the slot on the turrets, and I don't know how well you guys can read it, but there are instructions on the turret as to which way is left and right and all that kind of thing. So there is that. But very simple, very durable optic, and that does provide some level of magnification, which is better than the red dots, because a red dot by themselves don't have any magnification. So if you want to see things at distance a little bit better, some level of magnification is good. These do that. And what is nice about this particular one, this is a primary arms GLX 2X prism scope, and what's nice about this one is that it does actually have an illuminated reticle. That's why it has this little dial on the side. This dial on the side is basically the brightness level that you want your illuminated reticle to be at. I'm not sure if you guys can see it. There we go. That is the reticle. It's not coming up very clearly on the camera, but it is basically an outer horseshoe with a little chevron in the middle. And for my eye, because I don't have very good vision, it's kind of a small reticle, and so it's not as useful, especially at distance, as I would prefer that it is, but it's every bit as useful as a red dot is, if not a little bit more. The nice thing about prism scopes as well is they tend to work out better for people with astigmatism. In addition to being nearsighted, I also have astigmatism, and these are going to be a little bit clearer. And the nice thing about it is, even if I turn it off, you probably won't be able to see it here, but yeah, actually you can. You can actually still make out the reticle. Even with the illumination turned all the way off, you can actually still pick up a reticle in there. So even if the battery dies on this thing, you'll still have something to aim with. That is something you don't have on red dots. On a typical red dot like the Holosun, if the battery dies, you're out of luck. Now, granted, the battery life is super long on these things, but if the battery dies, you're out of luck. On a prism scope, as long as you have enough ambient light, you can still make out the reticle in there, and you will be just fine and good to go. So like I said, even though the light is completely off, that reticle is still there. You can still make it out. You still have something to aim with. So that is really cool. It works better for people with astigmatism. And it is illuminated. And what's also cool about this one is that it is a shake awake. Now the battery life on this is not as long. This is only a 20,000 hour battery life. But like I said, a year only has, less than 8,800 hours in it. So you're still well over a year. And so again, as long as you replace the batteries on this thing at least once a year, you're still good to go. And even if the battery dies, you can still make out that reticle. I have it illuminated right now, but you can still make out that reticle even without all of that. So these are really cool. They allow you to get a little bit more distance. This one has shake awake technology, so that if I happen to forget to turn off the illumination, it's not going to absolutely kill the battery. And even if the battery does go down, I can still make out a reticle in there. That is pretty awesome. So that has been my little foray into optics. Nothing here is overly expensive, just because my budget is not all that high. The Holosuns, those are these ones that I actually mount on the pistol caliber brace guns or on rifles. On the brace guns or on rifles. Those ones are usually about $200, and they do come with mounts, which is great. Sometimes more, sometimes less, like I said, depending on the sale that you get them on. The pistol red dot sight, that one's a little bit more expensive. That's usually going to be somewhere in the $250 to $300 range, but still, as far as optics go, not bad. The Vortex by itself, without the mounting options, was about $200 to get to the proper mounts for it at the right height. That's going to be another $50 to $100. So that wasn't so fun. And then the prism scope is usually about $400. And then the mount for it, because this is an AK side mount, and this is actually a fairly fancy one, and the mount itself costs about $200. So this is actually my most expensive sight to date, sighting system to date. The whole thing together is about $600, which kind of hurts because I could get another gun for that much, but it works real well. And for people who are wondering about the side mounts for AKs, this one actually holds zero real well. This is an RS Regulate side mount, and it's actually adjustable left and right, so I can make sure that it's actually centered over the bore, the center line of the rifle, and it holds zero real well. I can take this on and off the gun as many times as I want to, shoot in between, all that kind of stuff, and it returns to zero very, very, very well. No perceivable difference. Now, part of it is that it's an AK, and AKs aren't super accurate to begin with, but within the capabilities of the gun, there is no perceivable shift with this thing. As long as you have it appropriately tightened down, and the instructions will tell you how to do that, as long as you have it appropriately tightened down, when you take it on and off, it's just fine. These things are awesome. They're expensive, at least compared to my other ones, my other optics, but works fantastically great. Alright, so that is my foray into optics, learning not to over-tighten screws, learning the wonderful value of thread locker, Loctite thread locker, discovering that there's a reason why certain caps are shaped the way that they are. Probably not a good idea to put them in your pocket where they get a bunch of lint on them. All those good kinds of things. Sharing all of my embarrassing details and embarrassing stories so that you guys don't make the mistakes that I did. Thank you all very much for your time and attention. For those of you who are in Christ, go with God and be blessed. For those of you who are not, I pray that you come to know the true Christ of history. Amen.